You're listening to Honestly Mental, the podcast, and I'm your host, Erica Diaz. I'm a wife, a mama, a woman in leadership, but y'all, I'm a perfectly imperfect human. I have depression, PTSD, and generalized anxiety disorder, and I am figuring it out every single day. It's really been quite the journey, so this podcast aims to provide a raw and authentic approach to several issues surrounding mental health. Through the lens of our guests and I, we will provide insight into how we navigated our own challenges through honest and vulnerable conversation. We are building a community of individuals committed to changing the world, one conversation, one person at a time. We are raising awareness by destigmatizing mental health through continuing the conversation. We are providing hope and ultimately have a goal of saving the lives of those who may be feeling dark and alone. On today's episode, I'm excited to have our guest, Ashley Andersen, join us as the SVP of ClearEdge Rising. ClearEdge Rising is a leadership development community for women across the talent industry, and it combines the very best of learning, support, and relationship building. Ashley oversees the end-to-end experience. I happen to be a part of this amazing program, and it's been so instrumental in my growth as a human. She's also studied as a clinical social worker and has a unique background, which we'll get into throughout the podcast. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you for having me, Erica. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited that you are here as well. I know today's episode is going to be about emotional literacy and the pitfalls of not letting in emotions. Mm-hmm. And some of it's going to be geared towards the professional environment, which I think is fabulous because that's certainly an area that we need to be talking about this conversation and equipping managers with tools and how to handle this as we continue to break down barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think traditionally we've thought that the only place for conversations about emotions are in arenas like a therapeutic setting. And while that's absolutely a fitting place for emotional conversations, we do need to start getting more comfortable and more literate in the workplace. And especially our leaders need to start to equip themselves and skill themselves up with this ability to talk about emotions. In my work as a coach and working on leadership development, sometimes I get some pushback from people saying like, well, isn't that HR's responsibility? But it really is all of our responsibilities to start to become more familiar with, more skilled in speaking about emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a critical topic. And with, the world of work changing to focus around mental wellness, mental well-being, I think it's very prudent that we have this discussion. So with that, for you at home, Ashley, it would be great if you could kind of describe what emotional literacy means to you, both, maybe you hit on this a little bit already, but professionally in the workplace, and if you have any additional insight from what that could mean for individuals.
Sure. Yeah, because it might be a term that is unfamiliar to many out there. I know for me, I had heard a lot about emotional intelligence when I was in undergrad and grad school, but not so much emotional literacy. And I don't think it was until I went through Brené Brown's certification to become one of her Dare to Lead facilitators that I learned of this term, emotional literacy. And if you're at all familiar with her work, she focuses in on this concept of emotional literacy. And there are some similarities to emotional intelligence. It's not all that different, but ultimately being emotionally literate is about being able to identify emotions in ourselves, being able to understand what different emotions are, how many, the broad spectrum of emotions that exist. The research shows that most people can only identify three emotions in themselves as they're experiencing them: mad, sad, and glad, some version of that. When in fact, there are like 80 plus different emotions and emotional experiences that we all as humans go through at some point or another. So there's a lot of implications for that lack of awareness, that lack of understanding around emotions. And sometimes this is because, we don't spend a ton of time in school studying emotions, unfortunately. But it can also be that we have kind of inherent discomforts with certain emotions. We all have like certain things that are uncomfortable for us to be with, and then we avoid those. So ultimately, when we're talking about emotional literacy, particularly in the workplace, it's not that we're saying you need to become a therapist or you need to, therapize your direct reports. It's that you need to become comfortable with having conversations about emotions, with surfacing them, with being with them, with knowing those implications, how they show up, what they look like, what they're there for, and really how to work with people in those different emotional experiences, just as a human, again, not from a clinical standpoint.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth by indicating, and just highlighting we are all human. So it doesn't matter if you're a leader or a people leader at that. You are a human, an emotional being yourself. So I would imagine one of the first steps toward emotional literacy would be recognizing your own emotions. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. You're not going to be able to get curious with others about theirs and help understand people's behaviors based on their emotions if you haven't done the work to understand your own emotions and how they trigger you and how they show up, and the different reactions and responses that they can cause.
And it brings up again the why us having this conversation for you at home is so important, because as much as it shouldn't be new, it really feels like finally workplaces are trying to figure out mental wellness and mental well-being, and wanting to look at these types of conversations and how they can equip their managers. So it's just so timely. I think COVID kind of sent us in this tailspin of needing to balance employee burnout and different things that were occurring because we were at home all of a sudden, for people who are social beings and enjoy being around other humans. Just the different implications of what COVID did by, over the last few years, forcing us to stay in our houses with little social gatherings outside of it. So I think some of that has helped spearhead, if you will, or propel forward the conversation. So I think that's the good news. You hit on emotional intelligence already. And, I was kind of thinking to myself, emotional literacy and emotional intelligence are absolutely different. So I think, since we've already defined emotional literacy, could you also go into emotional intelligence just a little bit further? But really, in this context, we are looking at them very differently.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's okay for me to push back a little. I don't know that for me that I would say very different, at least the way that I conceptualize the two terms. And it's absolutely okay for us to have different perspectives on this. I think ultimately, as long as we're having these types of conversations, whether we're having them about emotional intelligence or emotional literacy, I'm all for it, right? Because it brings emotions to the surface, and it brings us all into more regular conversation about emotions, which is ultimately the purpose. But I think for me, when I look at the difference, the emotional literacy is like a deeper level of emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence, I think for lack of not going too far into kind of a whole lecture is the way that I look at it, more of the understanding, whereas emotional literacy brings that depth of being able to wrestle with, converse with, and have deeper conversations about, to not just understand that there is this broad spectrum of emotions that exist, or not just understand that I'm experiencing an emotion, but how do I take it to that next level of communicating, articulating, helping others to do the same, of getting curious about emotions, of developing, I don't want to necessarily say comfort, because emotions and conversations about them are inherently vulnerable. And so there's always going to be a level of discomfort there. But how can we enact our own internal courage to be able to stay in that discomfort, to in service of being able to better know what we need, and ask for what we need, and help others to do the same.
Yes, absolutely. So much in that. And you are totally fine to push back. I said the word very different, and also kind of was like, maybe not so different.
Yeah, I figured you would be open to a little challenging.
For sure. And, as we're talking about this, I'm going to go back a little bit to an element that you had noted early on, so that we can, continue to dive into this conversation about emotional literacy. It is crazy to me that most humans can identify only 3 emotions, especially when there are so many more. Or maybe it's not so surprising, but it's definitely a problem. Because you can't work on certain things without being true to your emotions and honoring them and letting them in. So that's why in a bit we'll get, more into what happens when you don't let those emotions in. But I just wanted to highlight that. And one thing that I think is really neat that you do in the ClearEdge Rising program, Ashley, is the emotional check-in at the very beginning of our sessions. It's okay, name 2 emotions. And, it's good to see variety there. When I was in my partial hospitalization program earlier this year, we had that list of 80 plus emotions, and we did the exact same thing. What 2 emotions are you feeling right now? But it was much more helpful, and also much more specific on honing in on what emotion we were feeling when you're getting outside of just mad, sad, and glad, as you said, or just a version of that.
Yeah. It's a really powerful way. I mean, again, I learned that from Brene Brown, who is a researcher and author, for those who might not be familiar. Her book on leadership is one of the most popular and seminal books on leadership, Dare to Lead, because it is based on research. And a lot of her research is around emotions. And she actually has a book that followed that one called Atlas of the Heart, which goes into all of those. I think there are 86 different emotions and emotional experiences. So if you're looking for a way to kind of hone that skill, or build that skill for yourself, or for yourself as a leader, that's a great book to dive into. But that really simple exercise of just a 2-word check-in, and there's no context, there's no explanation, there's no good or bad or right or wrong. It's just 2 words that you're feeling, and it gets people to really start to connect with emotions. So it starts to build that skill in themselves of going, what am I feeling? And I'll be honest, even for myself, when I participate in that, I'm like, there are some days I'm so wrapped up in everything that's going on around me that I haven't paused to acknowledge what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing. So it's really helpful in that way. It also creates an environment, especially in the workplace, where you're sending the message that it's okay for us to talk about emotions. It's okay for us to be feeling, stressed or frustrated, or joyful, and like all of those emotions can exist. Even within ourselves, we can be feeling kind of that confluence of different emotions. But especially in the space, like you can be on a team, and if you do that check-in on a team meeting, you might have one team member who's really frustrated, and you might have another team member who's really excited, and both of those things are okay. And when we have those practices built into our meetings and our conversations, then we're telling people, we're inviting in their sharing. And it's just a great kind of cultural tool when you talk about organizations.
Yeah, and it puts you in a position to meet your employees where they are. And it also does the same for you, for them to meet you, because again, you as a leader are a human. And so nobody is, immune to stressful days, frustrated days, etc. And if we're honest about our productivity levels, some of those really hard, challenging days may not be our best days productivity wise either, right? And so those checking in and meeting people where they're at, I think, is a huge step toward this and emotional literacy.
Yeah. And it's one of the more uncomfortable things about emotions and exploring them with other people is just being with them and just acknowledging them and thanking them for sharing with you, and not jumping to repair mode and like, how do I fix that? How do I fix you? And how do I make everything better? So
that's a good point.
Right? Like so often what we need is just to be acknowledged, just to like air out what it is we're feeling. And for another person to go, wow, that sounds so challenging, or that's so difficult, or how exciting. And not for that person to come in and fix everything. In all reality, they usually can't fix everything. So it's that's one of the biggest challenges when it comes to like leadership, is helping leaders to recognize that by surfacing conversations about emotions, it doesn't then become your job to fix whatever that thing is. I mean, if the pain point exists within your relationship, then yes, there is a responsibility there. Or if it's about, something related to that person's workload, and you have the ability to influence that, then yes. But so often people are just wanting to be acknowledged and heard and not fixed.
Yeah. And it's such a good point to bring up in this conversation. Admittedly, I'm a fixer. Granted, I tend to prefer trying to help fix other people before I focus on myself, or at least that was my MO for many years until recently. But, even I have gotten in the practice of, when somebody is being vulnerable with me, and that's even whether it's in the professional workplace or a personal setting, where I take it in and I say, okay, what do you need from me in this moment? And it's not necessarily this formal all the time, but really it's, are you looking for my advice? Do you want my opinion? Do you want me just to acknowledge you? And so even asking those questions, again, being curious, is helpful in that situation to uncover what the wants and needs really are from those around you when you're having the conversations. And ultimately, you're right. It's not a scenario where it's your job to fix somebody. But if you do ask if there's anything you can do to support or help them, that does enable or empower them to ask for help in some scenarios where they might need it. So being curious and asking additional questions about that will help, I think, pinpoint, is somebody looking for that acknowledgement, or is there something that I can do within reason to support this person?
Yeah, it's such a great practice. And I'll point out that in order to be able to do that practice that you just shared, you have to be present, right? You can't be having a conversation with somebody while you're also checking your email, while you're also in your phone, while you're also, doing whatever else is needing to be done. You have to be really present with them, and you have to be able to take that pause to go, okay, like, let me manage that inclination that I know I have to fix. And for some people, for a lot of people, it's to fix. For some people, it's like to champion. You go to somebody with something hard and they're like, oh, you got this. It's going to be great. And you're like, I don't really need the championing. Sometimes you do, but a lot of times it's like, I just need you to say that it sucks. Right? Like that holds a lot more weight than you trying to make everything, like, paint the silver lining around everything. But you have to be able to, like, know what your inclinations, your reactivities are to people sharing hard things, so that you can self-manage and go, okay, pause, let me ask them what it is that they actually need. And what a wonderful, like, gift to be able to give that person, to then be empowered to say, oh, what I actually need is just an opportunity to vent, or what I actually need is an ally in this, or, and it really helps when, again, so much of my work is about leadership. So when we're talking about leading other people, you want to be helping them grow and develop along the way. And so when they come to you with something hard, even just that asking, what do you need? You're helping them to develop their own emotional literacy, their own ability to identify what it is that they actually need, and articulate that. So it's really kind of a win-win for both people involved.
Right. Absolutely. So we've talked a couple points that you've made about being present, creating an environment or fostering an environment where it's okay for us to talk about our emotions. But if you're a new manager or a new people leader, or this is something that is really intriguing to you, like, where could somebody start on their journey toward emotional literacy? What does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can look like a lot of things. I mean, just listening to this, and if you're, like, nodding along and your interest is piqued, you've started on your journey.
Yes.
And recognizing that it is a lifelong journey. So it's not something where you're going to read a book and go, oh, okay, check. I checked the box. I'm all set on emotional literacy, because we shift and evolve as humans. And so what was once uncomfortable for us might become comfortable. What we were once afraid of, we might not be afraid of anymore, and something else might be conjuring up fear in us. So we have to take this commitment to constantly working on ourselves in this way. And I don't want to say that in a way that's, like, daunting. To me, that's exciting, because it's getting to know yourself at all of these different points of your evolution in different ways, in more intimate ways at each stage of your evolution as a human, which is pretty cool. But I would say, if you want to do the work on your own, that you can, there are a lot of books. I mentioned one, Atlas of the Heart, but there are many other books. If you go on, Google or Amazon or wherever your favorite place to buy books is, and type in books on emotions, you're going to find plenty. And so just doing that education piece of starting to expand. So going beyond that mad, sad, glad. And I want to clarify that research is about identifying emotions in yourself as you're experiencing them. So, like, people can sit down and write out a list of emotions, but that's not really helpful. What we need more of is to be able to know right now what I'm experiencing is this. And so that's really what we're looking for with emotional literacy. And so education is a great place to start to recognize, like, what are the ones beyond mad, sad, glad. You can Google, like, what would I call it? An emotions wheel, or an emotions chart. And you're going to get a lot of different resources for that. It's probably going to be a colorful wheel. This is probably what you were talking about, Erica, that you would be looking at therapeutic setting to point at, right? Yep, they're used a lot in therapeutic settings, but in my coaching work, I've used them a lot with leaders to start to expand their awareness of what emotions exist. And then, I think it's helpful if you want to take it a step further and start to better understand, what emotions are difficult for me to be with, because that's going to be unique to everybody. What emotions do I tend to shut down in myself or in others? That's work that's really helpful to do with somebody else. So that might be a therapist, it might be a coach, it might be kind of like peer-to-peer conversations if you have a buddy who also wants to dive into this work with you. But doing some of that like conversational exploration is really powerful.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote that you had shared in one of our sessions. The future belongs to the curious. Mm-hmm. And that comes to mind. I actually have a sticky note on my desk with that, because in so many different ways that is applicable. Just the curiosity in of itself, and genuine curiosity and asking questions and wanting to learn more. Naturally helps kind of, you at home towards emotional literacy. It helps even being curious about yourself. Okay, so I'm feeling anxious today. What could be going on in my world that is, allowing that emotion to creep in a bit? Let's sit there and honor that. So I just wanted to call it out because it's been such a good quote for me. And I think it's applicable here as well. Research is your friend at the end of the day when it comes to educating yourself on some of this.
Yeah. And that curiosity piece, it's one of the reasons why within our ClearEdge Rising sessions that we don't like break you out into a small group and go, just connect with one another. Like we give you questions to help stoke that curiosity, because sometimes it's hard when you're in with other, people who you may have different levels of knowledge of, maybe it's a close relationship, maybe this is somebody new. And so being able to have some prompts to stoke that curiosity is helpful. And that's something people can integrate into their one-on-ones, their team meetings, their conversations with their family. If you kind of make it a game, if you will, then it can take the pressure off a bit. And it can be like, oh, well, I'm just answering this question that we do every night or that we do in every team meeting. And there becomes this level of like expectation. Yeah. The other thing that I would add that what you just shared made me think of, Erica, is that like our feelings, their number one job is to be felt, right? Like they just want to be felt. Like a nagging toddler just wants to be heard and recognized. And once you hear and recognize them, then they tend to quiet down. Not always, but our feelings are the same way. And so if we are able to just simply, with that neutrality that you just so perfectly shared with us, like, oh, there's anxiousness here today. What is that about? What does this anxiety want me to know? Why is it trying to grab my attention? Like, rather than putting these labels on our emotions of I shouldn't be anxious, anxiety is bad, this is good, because when we make something bad or wrong, then we cut off our ability to learn from it, because we get over we pay too much attention to shutting it down, right? We don't want to be associated with that bad thing. And so we try to shove it under the rug. And just like the nagging toddler, for any parents out there, like they're gonna pop up again and start that tantrum. And so you can shove down that anxiety, whatever the emotion is, it's gonna come up again because it has something that it wants you to learn or to know. And so I loved that you just said that. So so neutrally and with so much genuine curiosity, because that's what our emotions want from us.
Yeah, they want to be recognized, and I think it's it reminds me of my time in the PHP program too, where I feel like I should have known this and I probably had heard it, but like I really, really leaned into and owned that there are no such things as bad emotions, right? Mm-hmm. Like our brain is such a primitive, it's fascinating really, because it's primitive in the sense that its job is to protect us, and emotions can kind of help guide that, right? And that's why it's important to get curious about what's coming in. And so it's one of those things that's really interesting, but there really are not bad emotions. I've made a habit in my house. I have an 11-year-old son, and he probably wants to kill me sometimes, but we talk about emotions a lot. And when he is like, how's school today? Did you find something that was exciting? Was there something that you didn't like so much? Let's talk about that. And he also himself is really kind of stuck around those three main emotions that people recognize. We talk about how emotions are not, there is no such thing as a bad emotion. And my hope is by having conversations and opportunities like that to remind him, he'll grow up a bit differently than I did without the biases around bad emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, I think that there's a lot of evolution that's happening when it comes to parenting and teaching and those types of relationships, where we are being more mindful of how we are tending to kids when they're experiencing different emotions, how we're labeling or not, hopefully, different emotions. But the fact of the matter is that like culturally, that still exists in a lot of, media and TV, movies, whatnot. And so I think he might be annoyed by it. He might roll his eyes, but the more you can do that, the better, because it does offset all of those influences that are out of your control, right? And even talking to you and hearing you speak of your time in the hospital, like talk about education, right?
Yes.
And I'm just thinking, like, I've worked with leaders in coaching and different environments who are trying to gain those exact skills that you're talking about that you gained in your time in the hospital. That ability to know that there isn't a bad and a good emotion, that they're all just there to inform us. Like, I think that experience, as difficult as it was for you, has given you so much skill in this area of emotional literacy.
Yeah. My time there, as scary as it was, and just such a crazy time in my life, I consider it invaluable. I learned so much. I have a binder. I just pulled it out actually of all of the things that I learned. And it's a literal toolbox for me to pull out and say, okay, well, remember this when we covered it, so it was such a unique experience. I hadn't even heard of partial hospitalization programs until I was recommended to be in one. And so, not that I am suggesting that everybody should go through it by any means. There are certainly, it's a method of care where if you're really, really struggling, that I would highly recommend it. But I know that's a little bit off topic, but it's just so true that I learned so many things through that program. And I'm glad to hear it is helping me toward emotional literacy. And it's really part of the foundation of why I wanted this podcast, to talk about those things, and bring awareness toward them.
Yeah. Well, and I say it because I think that there are probably a lot of people who, I know that there are a lot of people out there. There are probably a lot of people listening to this who are, there's a lot of stigma around being even in therapy, let alone in any type of hospitalization. And people, they put off getting the care that they need because they think that it makes them weak or less than. And so I wanted to bring it up because it's such a great example of how it absolutely doesn't make you weak or less than. In fact, it's just the opposite. Like that has made you a stronger, better human. And again, like I'm looking at it from my lens of leadership development, that absolutely makes you a stronger, better leader. So I think sometimes we want to have all the skills without going through the pain. And sometimes it's the most painful experiences in our lives that become our greatest teachers and become the experiences that skill us up the most. And so for anybody who has been in a similar situation where they're feeling like I'm less than, or I'm not enough, or I'm weak because of this, I just hope that they hear in your sharing and your experience of how opposite that really is.
Yeah. And it's a journey to get there. It really is. And that's my hope too, through publicizing my experience. I hope it's enough to resonate with you at home and just those listening. And, even in the workplace, as you said, bringing back that leadership hat, I think there are just so many benefits to emotional literacy. Ashley, you were in social work, and you work directly with children and families, and that was through child protection services, right? And so I've got to imagine that, you tell me though, it was an absolute must for you in your position to understand emotional regulation, understand your emotions in what I can only imagine to be some of the most awful circumstances, and others, of course, being more positive with reunification and different things like that. But would love to hear from you how your work there has lent itself to the world of leadership and how we talk about mental health and mental well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. It was such a great career experience, and not just career experience, but just human development for myself experience working in that field. And to your point, like extremely difficult and being faced with very impossible circumstances. Yeah. And, when you were asking that, I was thinking on both fronts. Like for me, it was really important to understand what emotions were hard for me to be with. So for me personally, anger is very hard for me to be around. So it's hard for me to feel anger. It's hard for me to allow myself to feel anger. It's also hard for me to be in the room with somebody else who's visibly angry. And that's kind of been my lifelong emotion work has been around anger. And as you can imagine, when you are a frontline caseworker and in people's homes and having to make really hard decisions with them and share hard information with them, there's a lot of anger, rightly so. Yeah. So if I were not doing that work to understand my own reactivity around anger, it could have put me in a position where I was, being really lacking compassion. It could have put me in a position where my decision-making was compromised, where I was mistreating families. And so it was really important for me to be able to do that work for myself. Now, there might be people who are like, oh, I don't work in as high stakes, as high emotions of a field. But I would urge you to not shut off because that's the case, because
Right.
at the end of the day, like, we're all human beings, and somebody who's upset and angry and panicked because their child is being removed from them is not different than somebody who is fearful and angry and upset because they are facing a layoff potentially.
Yeah.
And being able to be with that person in that emotion is going to be just as important for that leader as it was for me as a child protection worker. And it also, there's a quote from this neuroscientist that always sticks with me, Antonio Damasio. He says, "We are not thinking machines that feel, we are feeling machines that think." And so ultimately, like, if we're talking about building relationships, and using those relationships to help one another, which, regardless of whether that's child protection or staffing or healthcare, any industry, that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We need to tap into that, those emotions, and be able to be with those emotions.
You brought up for me in talking about anger, just as an example of something that I think leaders did really well during my recent layoff. As one could imagine, I was not happy.
Right.
I was very angry. I was mad. I got sad eventually, but my initial reaction was very, very angry. I hadn't experienced a layoff or having been fired before. And so anger was my first. And I will say, one of my leaders, she doesn't know this, but one of the best things she did is she reached out and indicated that she understands my need for space if it was, if I needed that. And she wanted to respect that. So, it's just meeting employees where they are, right? I think for her to have the emotional intelligence in that scenario, or literacy, to recognize that getting laid off sucked. And if I wasn't ready to talk about it or get on the phone with someone or, feel anything other than the anger, she allowed that for me. She almost invited that in. And, while at the time I was still in such a state of anger, I can look back now and I really respect and appreciate what that leader did in the circumstances, because it was difficult for them too, right? Yeah. Like, layoffs aren't easy for anyone, regardless of the side that you're on. So that's almost a tangible example of that in practice for our listeners.
Yeah. And it's such a great tangible example because you're talking about grief, which is an emotional experience that we often attribute just to the loss of life, but we are surrounded by all the time. A layoff, like, the person impacted or the people impacted feel that, the people left feel that. A loss of a client, like a failure of a project, like all of those things create grief. Somebody leaves an organization, even if it's on good terms, for something exciting, there's grief there, there's disappointment, there's loss, and those are complex emotions. And I love that what stood out to you as being the most impactful was really simple, and probably was hard for that leader, because as leaders, we have an inclination to lead, to like take the reins, to make everything better, to problem solve, right? And there's a time and a place for all of that, but there's also a time and a place to like set those reins down, to not come at the person with a solution, and to just allow for them to have that time and space, and allow for them to feel whatever it is they're feeling. And it's not to say that there aren't still boundaries. Like you can be angry and you can be angry with, certain boundaries. It doesn't mean we have to like let people throw tables or anything.
Right.
But you can simply say it's okay to be upset. Like I would be upset as well. And that's going to go so far for that individual and for that relationship, because they are seen and heard and understood.
And that is so valuable, being seen, heard, and understood. That was actually what led to my mental health crisis earlier this year, is not feeling seen or heard and not understood. And just it created this almost gap in my identity. I felt like it was awful. So I think that's another thing to point out, right? Is that the human side of us, whether people leaders, whether just being individuals working for other people, on top of being human, part of that is being seen and heard and understood, which plays into emotional literacy, as you all are, working toward that and wherever you are at in your journey. One of the other things that I want to talk about too is the pitfalls of not letting in emotions, right? So you've shared a lot on emotional literacy and some very actionable items that people can take away from this episode and apply in their daily lives. But I'd be remiss if we didn't cover what happens when we don't let those emotions in, in the workplace, and what that, translates to.
Yeah. But I'll put it in the context of a story. So I was running a Dare to Lead workshop, and this was with an entire county in a state, all of their leadership. And this was a very high profile county, and they had a lot of action in the law enforcement department of the county. And their sheriff and their sheriff's deputy and a couple of folks from their sheriff's office were part of this workshop, which was fantastic to have them there. And the workshop is all about courageous leadership. Again, for those not familiar with Dare to Lead, it's all about how do we cultivate more courageous leadership within ourselves, more courageousness amongst our teams in organizational settings. And we got to this part of the workshop about emotional literacy, and specifically talking about the emotions that you can't stand to be with, as part of that development of your emotional literacy. And we asked for a volunteer to just share about the emotion that they can't be with. And the sheriff volunteered very nicely and shared with us that the emotion he can't be with is anxiousness. And we asked, how do you know that that's the case? And he said, well, my wife has told me. Sometimes our partners are our greatest informers, right, of the areas we need to work on, whether we want to hear it or not. He said, my wife has told me, because every time she comes to me with a worry, I tell her everything's fine. That's not a big deal, like kind of shut her down. And so because this workshop was in a work setting, we applied it to his work with his deputies. And ultimately the conversation led to, this sheriff is overseeing hundreds of deputies who are, that's a job where you are experiencing anxiousness all the time, right? Like there's so much uncertainty and risk there that there's a lot of anxiety. When they come to him in that state, he shuts them down by telling them that everything will be okay.
Ooh. Mm-hmm.
What happens, the question that I posed to him was, does that make their anxiety go away? And it makes it go away for him, is what his answer was.
Yep.
But he was wise enough. He was a super insightful and wonderful human, very open to, his own areas for growth. And what he recognized was, yes, that made that go away for him, but it absolutely doesn't make it go away for them. And what it actually does is it makes them stuff down that anxiousness, which is inevitable in that job. And that pops up in other dysfunctional ways. And he was able to list off multiple dysfunctional ways, whether that was about team dynamics, whether it was about, poor behavior in the field, whether it was about misreporting. I mean, these are huge, huge implications for this particular person and this particular field. So, when you talk about what are the ramifications, I think there are some very personal ramifications whereby we know, and the research shows, that the more you stuff emotions, like, you can have physical ailments. It can pop up in a back pain and a neck pain and actual illnesses. It can all of a sudden pop up in a relationship. If you've ever been like, wow, why did that person react that way? What I said to them wasn't even that big of a deal. A lot of times that might be because they're not reconciling with their own emotions. They're not dealing with what their emotions are wanting to, grab their attention around and tell them. And so it's coming out in other ways. So there are really big implications, personal and then broad sweeping, when we talk about, opting out to the extent that you can of building emotional literacy.
Yeah. And it doesn't, just by avoiding it, right? It doesn't go away. To your point, it manifests itself in other, probably less than helpful ways, in the manner of dysfunction. And so from a workplace perspective and leadership perspective, that, just even without emotional literacy, I think that leaders want to have a functional environment, and where people feel comfortable, where they do feel seen and heard. But in a scenario of someone really avoiding, I think about when we first started chatting too, right? Like, if you're meeting your employee where they are and they're frustrated and having a bad day and you just brush it off, man, that's insensitive. So that does absolutely nothing positive for that person. It maybe helps you, I guess, but it's really just not helpful to the overall situation. And that's where almost those seeds start to get planted for that dysfunction to grow and continue. And then, I think negativity is very, what is the word that I'm looking for here? Contagious too, right? And so I can see how very quickly it could lead to dysfunction in the workplace by just avoiding things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to your point about being seen and heard and understood, I think that's a concept that we would all agree is important and that we would all agree we want to foster, whether that's in our family, in our, friendships, or in our working relationships. But it doesn't just happen. We can't just want to be the person that creates that feeling for people. We have to build the skill to be able to show up in that way. And I think that's where this emotional literacy topic comes into play. Like, we can't just have the intention of seeing, hearing, and understanding people. We have to do the work.
Yeah, I agree. And the work it's so important and it's so critical. I think that is the difference, where you've taken emotional intelligence to build the skill to show up, and going back to when you said being present, right? And then knowing what your inclinations are to certain emotions, first starting with your emotions, right? So I'm going to go back a little bit. First, number one, I think on the path towards emotional literacy, you have to be aware of your own emotions, and you have to allow those in yourself, personally, professionally. Obviously, we're not talking if it's anger, throwing tables, right?
Mm-hmm.
But sharing that you're frustrated. Or I remember there was a scenario at a previous employer where honestly the situation just sucked. Like, it just sucked. I didn't need the corporate fluff at all. Like, I could see through it. And let's not fool ourselves. Most people can see through the fluff, right? Like, let's just be honest about that. And so I just wanted my manager to acknowledge that it sucked, like, and it's okay to suck. I would have preferred a manager who had said that. Like, I wasn't looking to them for the structure or, well, I mean, in some ways, yes, but in this scenario, right? Like, they were just in it as much as I was. And so I didn't need them to be that stoic leader. I much more preferred the I'm in it with you, like, this sucks type of thing. And I think that goes so much further toward being present, building and fostering an appropriate environment to express emotions, and increasing productivity. I think it's one of those things that, as we talk about the workplace, there are absolutely benefits to emotional intelligence and emotional literacy. There's research out there that looks at, top performers. Now, this is more along the lines of emotional intelligence, but, there's a study from UC Berkeley that determined emotional intelligence is 4 times better at predicting a person's success than measuring IQ. So that translates to dollars for companies. There's not a downfall in fostering an environment where emotions are okay. You know what I mean? And so I think it's so important that companies really take a look at how they're doing that. Leaders can do it individually within their own teams. This doesn't need to be change the philosophy of the whole company. It's starting small. Start with where you can have an impact, and look at what you can do or how you can affect or impact your teams to influence them toward that emotional literacy as well. It's mutually beneficial to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that comes to my mind as you're sharing that is psychological safety. I don't know. I've been having a lot of conversations about psychological safety, which is one of my favorite topics. But you need emotional literacy in order to create psychological safety. And so often when I've done workshops on that topic of psychological safety for companies, I'll get leaders that are like, well, so-and-so in the C-suite, like, they really create an unsafe environment. And so therefore I cannot influence safety at any other point in the company, which actually is not true. And it's a lot of what you're saying aligns with the research on psychological safety, which is that there's actually more influence on the individual team leader level than there is on the organizational leader level. And so one's immediate team leader can have such a great influence on things like safety or emotional literacy, vulnerability, courageousness. Like, I think sometimes I've witnessed leaders kind of give away their influence and their power because they're just, and I'm putting this in air quotes, just a middle manager or just XYZ, just a director, just a this. And the fact is that those relationships are hugely influential. Like, I can remember in my career that I passed up promotional opportunities because I was like, I'm not going to that team. Like, I know all about that team's leader, right? And I am not interested I will pass up that promotion, which is unfortunate for everybody involved, right? Yes. That was that was kind of the scenario. But all that to say that absolutely, like you have so much influence as a leader. And so if you decide to take on this work just for yourself so that you can influence those direct relationships, even if you don't have a team, like everybody's work is so filled with relationships with your clients, with your peers, with your suppliers, like all of these different relationships are going to benefit from you saying, you know what, I'm going to do some work to increase my own emotional literacy, let alone your own benefit. Like you're going to feel, or you're going to feel more connected and aligned and empowered as well.
And gosh, psychological safety. We won't tackle that today, but that could, that's a conversation to have for sure. So to summarize the conversation today, some very tangible actions to take from the episode, right?
Yeah.
First, it's understanding your own emotions and letting them in. Once you have the ability to do that and you're comfortable with that, it's being present and showing up and building the skill to show up, to be, to your point, what you said earlier, much more than just the intention being there. Mm-hmm. You have to make people feel seen and heard and to drive the behaviors that you're looking for and create that psychological safety. We talked about how research is your friend, that there are several resources out there available just even by Googling or picking up a Brené Brown book. And I have to admit, I have not read her books and I need to, because I've heard so much about her and I have a long list of books I need to read, but I've added her to mine. I'm really intrigued about the Atlas of the Heart. So I probably should start with Dare to Lead. But anyway, sorry, I digress.
That's okay.
Being present, fostering an environment where people understand that emotions are okay, and feelings are to be felt. So that's for both, your employees, for you, individual contributors. It's for everyone, because at the end of the day, we are all human.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if there's one thing that I would love for people to walk away from this conversation with, is to stop labeling our emotions. And I will say, like, I find myself every once in a while doing it, and I've been working on this for years. So this is what I mean when I'm like, this is lifelong work. Yes. Because we're wired to label things as good or bad. We love that binary. We love that concreteness. And it's messy in that middle, and it's like vague, and we don't love that. Our brain doesn't love that. But to just start to notice when you say, oh, I shouldn't be feeling that, or that's bad, or anything related to that good, bad label, and to instead practice curiosity, to shift into that neutral space in the middle and get curious about what's this emotion wanting from me. That would be fantastic if we could all do more of that for ourselves.
Yeah. And that is perfectly said. So on that note, Ashley, it's been such a pleasure having you. I thank you for sharing all that you did and the insights you've provided. And, thank you for everyone, listening in. If you are so inclined, please rate, comment, and share below if you don't mind, and take care.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.